Buenas tardes. You can use this video to help you preview the material in Chapter 4 and also to review when it comes time for a test. I'll share some insights with you about vocabulary, grammar, and culture. This chapter includes a fair number of words that are false cognates. That is, they look like words that you know from English, but they actually mean something different. And these are really important to study because Spanish instructors really like to include them on tests and quizzes. So, collar doesn't mean collar. Joyas doesn't mean joys. Libreria doesn't mean library. Marrón doesn't mean maroon. Medias is not related to media except very indirectly. Precioso doesn't mean precious. Vestido doesn't mean vest. So please consult the vocabulary list on page 77 and make sure that you know what these words do mean. The chapter also happens to include a fair number of words that are masculine even though they don't end in O. So collar and suéter are actually predictable because they end in R, which is another reliably masculine ending. Likewise, traje, suit, ends in aje. And all Spanish aje words, I believe, are masculine. Likewise, cinturón and pantalón, which is the singular of pantalones, these are masculine because they end in an on, which is reliably masculine. And then you have some that you just have to memorize because you can't look at them and just know if they're masculine or feminine. So el arete, el guante, el reloj. But all of the feminine words in the chapter are obviously feminine. On page 77, in addition to learning the words on the lists, you also need to learn the words that are used as category headings within the list. Two that are interesting are las compras, which means shopping. It's interesting because in English the same word is singular. La ropa is also interesting because in English we have singular clothing and also plural clothes. This is the singular version. Spanish also has a word, prendas, which means garments, but you don't need to worry about that. The other category names on the page are less interesting, but they're also included in our chapter vocabulary. Of course, a lot of these words have accent marks, and also, of course, every accent mark has a perfectly rational explanation and should be used correctly. If you haven't listened to it or if you're rusty, please go to my Spanish pronunciation and spelling review, and there's a general explanation of accent marks beginning at 6 minutes and 10 seconds. So, crédito and clásico are just like teléfono in that video. They end with an O, and they end with a vowel, so they should stress the next to last syllable, but instead stresses early, which is irregular, so they have to write an accent mark. Cinturón and marrón are like jardín in that video. They end with an N, so you would expect next to last stress, but instead they have final stress, which is irregular, so you have to mark it with an accent mark. Suéter is like lápiz in the video. It ends with R, which is a normal consonant, so you would expect the word to have final stress, but the stress is actually on the next to last syllable, and since that's irregular, you have to mark it with an accent mark. Finally, like dia in the video, chapeteria and most of the other store names take two vowels, the IA, and break them into two syllables. So chapeteria, panaderia, etc. The only exception in the chapter is farmacia, which has three syllables because it doesn't have an accent mark, so it doesn't split the IA into two syllables. The chapter has 5 grammar points. How to say need versus have to, how to say and some. This is more complicated than it sounds. There's higher numbers, which is basically vocabulary, demonstrative adjectives, which is straightforward, and the real meat of the chapter is the last topic, third person direct and indirect object pronouns, which in Spanish is really different from English. I'm sure you all know the verb tener, to have. Note that it's highly irregular. We have the yo form with a go, and then the tu, el, ella, usted, and ustedes forms all have the change to an IE. So it's a boot verb. Anyway, tener means to have. If you add a K and put it before an infinitive, it means have to, like tienen que estudiar, they have to study. Necesitar means to need. It's usually used with an object, like necesitas ayuda, but it could also be used with an infinitive, so like necesitas comer, do you need to eat? But it's somewhat more common to use tener que with verbs and necesitar with objects, with nouns. In Spanish, un and una correspond with a, and unos and unas correspond with some. They're used in a way which is surprisingly different from English, and somehow our textbook manages to sidestep all the important subtleties, even though you will need them for your homework. So do pay attention to this. The main point is that in general, Spanish uses a less than English does. So to begin with, jobs, religions, political parties, nationalities, these never have a, they never have un or una. So I would say, soy profesora, eres católico, él es demócrata, es estadounidense, even though in English we say I'm a teacher, you're a Catholic, he's a Democrat, she's an American. So no there. But more generally, anything that you usually encounter one at a time doesn't need a, un or una. So, necesitas visa. In English, do you need a visa? However, if you modify something and make it special as opposed to your usual one at a time business, then you do need un or una. So I would say, for example, él es profesor, he is a teacher, but él es un profesor excelente. So when you add the descriptor, it justifies the use of un or una. And that's true not only for things like professions. For plurals, please note that you need to use unos or unas for things that come in pairs or groups. For example, necesito unas tijeras. In English, you could just say, I need scissors, but in Spanish, it would be unas tijeras, or bajas por unas escaleras, go down some stairs or a stairway. So the stairs, las escaleras, are a group, so you would need unas. And again, you're going to need to apply these principles on your MyLab homework. Higher numbers are basically vocabulary, but of course they have some interesting aspects. The textbook presents the list of the vocabulary words starting with 1 all the way to 1,000, so 100, 200, 300, etc. So let's look at the interesting things here on the left. So first of all, you have both 100 and ciento. 100 is used by itself, as in 100 libros. But if you have a longer number, then you switch to ciento. Hay 103 libros. Then note that 3 of these hundreds words, the ones with asterisks, are irregular. Everything else, you just add cientos, like ocho, ochocientos, but quinientos, setecientos, and novecientos are irregular, so you have to memorize them. And then, in the table on the right, I've pulled out some differences between English and Spanish that you have to respect. The first one is that Spanish only uses the word y, meaning and, between the tens place and the ones place. So, for example, the example I have here is 66. Now, that is one case where English doesn't use it, 66. However, English will throw it in other places, like 350, but in Spanish, no, it's 350, or 1,004, 1,004. And that also shows that English sticks in the word a, and Spanish, as usual, doesn't like a, so it's just mil. The second row shows that English and Spanish use commas and periods the opposite way. They're just switched. A third is that because Spanish is Spanish, you have to care about masculine and feminine. So the word quinientos is going to change to quinientas if we're talking about 500 women instead of men. And finally, in English, we like to group longer numbers. So we'll take 1,352 and break it into 1352, not in Spanish. It's going to be 1352. The fourth grammar topic in the chapter is demonstrative adjectives. To demonstrate means basically to point out, and a demonstrative adjective points something out. So if you're pointing to this tree, in Spanish that would be este árbol. If you're pointing to that tree, that can either be in Spanish ese árbol if it's relatively close, or aquel árbol if it's further away. And this illustration is trying to show that with the hand gestures. Spanish being Spanish, each of these adjectives has 4 forms because of masculine, feminine, singular, and plural. The masculine singular forms are all interesting. Este and ese, this and that, end with an E, even though they're masculine, which is unusual. And aquel is short. It isn't aquello, which you would expect looking at the other forms. That's fairly common in Spanish, like uno means one, but you say un libro for a book. If you get confused about which words are which, you can just remember that this and these are the ones with the T's, and that and those aren't. This vocabulary is often associated with the words for here and there. Here can be either aquí or acá, depending on where you live, and there is either allí and allá, and in general, allá refers to something that is further away. Each demonstrative adjective also has a corresponding demonstrative pronoun, which is a stand-alone form. So instead of este árbol, you can say este, meaning this one. Or instead of ese árbol, that tree, you can say ese. And instead of aquel árbol, that tree, farther away, you can say aquello. And here you do use the O. Otherwise, the forms are identical. Here are some examples. I could say esta, this one, a girl, es una muy buena estudiante. Or if I'm talking about cookies, I could say esas, those ones, those cookies, son mis favoritas. If I'm talking about books, which are masculine, when I'm talking about the ones that are far away, I could say nunca he leído aquellos, those books over there. Spanish also has a 3-way set of gender-neuter demonstrative pronouns. So these are neither masculine nor feminine, so they're used to refer to unknown things where we don't know the gender, or also abstract concepts, which are neither girls nor boys. And these 3 are esto, eso, aquello. So they all end in O. So you can use these words to refer to something where you really don't know what the heck it is. So, for example, what is this? And esto es un vestido. Or what is that? Which would be, what is inside that nice box over that we have here. Eso es una gorra. It's actually a hat. Or que es aquello, referring to some strange building. Aquello, that over there, is a clothing store. So these all have a flavor of, what the heck is this thing or that thing? The O forms, esto, eso, and aquello, can also be used to refer to something abstract, an idea or a concept, as in estoy de acuerdo con eso que dice mi madre sobre la moda. I am in agreement with that which my mother says about clothing. So that would be eso. The real grammatical meat of this chapter is in the 5th grammatical topic, which is direct and indirect object pronouns. This topic is meaty because the difference between direct and indirect object pronouns just doesn't exist in English, but it's very important in Spanish. So look at the example, my boyfriend loves me, my boyfriend gives me flowers. We have me and me, but those 2 me's are actually pretty different. My boyfriend loves me means that I am the one who is loved. Whereas my boyfriend gives me flowers, it's flowers that are being given to me. And we call the first me a direct object pronoun, and the second me, which is really to me, an indirect object pronoun. So let's see again. Our teacher sees us versus our teacher shows us the equations. So our teacher sees us. We're the ones who are seen. So there, us is a direct object pronoun, as opposed to our teacher shows us the equations. It's the equations that are being shown, and they're being shown to us. So us is here an indirect object pronoun. Third example, Mary slapped him. So he's the one being slapped. Him is a direct object pronoun versus Mary sent him a letter. So the letter is what's being sent, but it is sent to him, which makes him an indirect object pronoun. Direct versus indirect, where the indirect have this idea of to sort of built into them. In some cases, the difference between direct and indirect object pronouns doesn't matter in Spanish either. So if you look at mi novio me quiere, mi novio me da flores, there we have the same word me, which just means me or to me, and it's the same whether it's in the direct or indirect situation. So mi novio me quiere, he loves me, I'm the one who's loved. Mi novio me da flores, he gives the flowers to me, me and me are the same. Or nuestra profesora nos ve, she sees us, we're the ones who are seen, versus nuestra profesora nos muestra las ecuaciones, she's showing the equations to us. So here nos is indirect. So with me and nos, it doesn't matter whether you're in a direct or an indirect situation, and the same is true of te, or if you live in Spain, os. Notice that these Spanish object pronouns like to snuggle up right before a conjugated verb. So in English, you say my boyfriend loves me, but it's in Spanish, mi novio me quiere, mi novio me da flores, nuestra profesora nos ve, nuestra profesora nos muestra las ecuaciones. This position before the conjugated verb is the basic one for object pronouns in Spanish, but you already know this because you know things like me llamo Judy. So here me, which is actually reflexive, is before llamo. Te quiero, I love you, or lo siento, which means literally I regret it. So it, here translated as lo, is again snuggled up right in front of the conjugated verb. However, if you have two verbs in a structure, then you have two possible pronoun positions. So if I want to visit you, this could be either te quiero visitar, with te snuggled up before the quiero, or it could be quiero visitarte, with the te, the object pronoun, just glommed onto the end of the infinitive. This is actually a lot more like English. So quiero visitarte, I want to visit you. So you have a choice. Do you treat these the same as the ones with one verb? Just remember, put it in front of the conjugated verb, or do you want to make it like English and you can put it afterwards? It's entirely up to you. These two are identical for all intents and purposes. Now, where the difference between direct and indirect matters for Spanish is with the third person. So if I say, Maria lo golpeó, Maria slapped him, Maria hit him, versus Maria le envió una carta, sent a letter to him, it has to be lo versus le. You have to use different pronouns. So I've laid out the full thing in the two tables below. In the third person, the direct object pronouns care about gender. They're lo, la, los, and las, whereas the indirect object pronouns don't have gender. It's just le and les. Because the third person situation is so common, him to him, her to her, you all to you all, it's really, really important for you to understand the difference between direct and indirect object pronouns. The best practice I know for this is on the Colby College website. I'm giving the URL here. You could also Google on Colby College practice Colby Spanish practice pronouns. I also have the URL of the homepage for this program on Blackboard. And you can see this is a screenshot of where you're going, and there's lots of different practice activities. The first ones are at our level, and then the others get more complicated. Now, because this is such a big concept, it's perhaps not surprising that Spanish dialects differ a lot in how they treat object pronouns. What I'm giving you is the standard treatment for Latin American Spanish. Please note that if you have a situation with a direct and an indirect object pronouns, like my boyfriend gives flowers to me. The teacher explains the equations to us. I send an email to him. Then typically the direct object is a thing and an indirect object is a person. However, keep in mind that a direct object can also be a person. So if he loves me, she sees us, she slaps him, a direct object can certainly be a person. But an indirect object is typically a person and not a thing. If you can stand it, an additional difference from English is the following. So in English, you could either say, I give him a book, or I give John a book, right? In Spanish, likewise, you can say, le doy un libro, I give him a book, or le doy un libro a Juan. What's going on here? We've mentioned a Juan specifically, so that's to John, but we're still using le. It's as if we're saying, I give him the book to John, but him and John are the same thing. It's redundant. However, the use of the indirect object pronoun here is required in Spanish, even though it's redundant. We call this a double marking, the indirect object. One final grammar bit. Gente sort of sneaks in on page 81 the concept of the personal a. They give the principle here that direct objects that are human require the preposition a. And here's an example for you. We say, visitamos Madrid. We visit Madrid, but visitamos a nuestros amigos en Madrid. We visit our friends in Madrid. So that a, the personal a, is completely untranslatable into English, but it's really is very important in Spanish. It's always used before direct objects that are human. Why? So one reason is that it's helpful when interpreting a question. So in English, if we ask, who does the doctor help versus who helps the doctor, those are really different. In the first one, we have the word does, and also help is at the end versus helps being earlier. So it's crystal clear. In Spanish, it's basically the same word order. A quien ayuda la doctora. So who does the doctor help? And there, a quien, that who is the person who is being helped. They're the direct object, so they get the a. Versus quien ayuda a la doctora. So who helps the doctor? And there, it's the doctor who's the direct object, and she gets the a. So Spanish and English handle this differentiation in completely different ways, and Spanish does it with the personal a. More generally speaking, Spanish has more flexible word order than English, and for this reason, the personal a sometimes helps you figure out who is doing what to whom. So, for example, if I say, if I want to say the tiger attacks the man versus the man attacks the tiger, you could actually do those words in practically any order. So here I've shown how you can actually start those two sentences with the verb, ataca, and then you could have tigre and hombre in the same order, but because of the personal a, you know that it's the man who's being attacked in ataca el tigre al hombre, and it is the man who is doing the attacking in ataca el tigre el hombre. The cultural content of the chapter is contained in the 3 lectures, El Mercado de Abasto, Buenos Aires Ley, which is actually really interesting, and Argentina, País de Inmigrantes, which is also very interesting. So I do hope that you enjoy those readings.